When The Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom released, speedrunners were eager to break it, and not only did they succeed in destroying it, but it might just be the most broken Zelda title in recent history. While the first speedruns clocked in at 5.5 hours, a glitch was soon discovered that resulted in a wrong warp, but there was a problem. Where the warp took you seemed to be random. If there's one thing speedrunners hate, it's RNG, and in today's video, we'll go over how a seemingly useless glitch led to over 4.5 hours of time save, so let's start with an overview of the first speedrun. Before the game became a broken mess of glitches and skips, which feels weird to say since this all happened in the span of 3 days, the route for completing the game was relatively straightforward. Your primary goal is to close rifts that have opened across Hyrule by completing dungeons and quests associated with them, with rifts being an integral part of the game as they contain the Still World, a bizarre and broken place where you need to use the game's main mechanic, Echoes, to progress. In total, there are 8 dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom if you're doing the main quest, and 3 optional dungeons if you partake in side quests, but the speedrun only goes into the main 8, which brings us to the first glitch that was found early on. Calling this a glitch may be a stretch, as the game certainly intends for you to use echoes to complete challenges and clear obstacles, but the old bed is perhaps one of the most broken echoes in the game. If you need to clear a gap, it has you covered. If you need to clear a really big gap, just spawn more beds. If you need to climb a ledge, just use a bed. Want to skip ahead in an area? Use a bed. Need to complete a puzzle? Bed. Need some hearts restored? Just use a bed. It's easily the echo with the most utility and is used constantly throughout the speedrun. For most of the dungeons, speedrunners have to complete the entirety of them as there aren't many major content skips within them, but the Jabal Ruins are an exception, and the first skip starts with a bed. In normal gameplay, you're supposed to walk over this section of floor, fall down, and get into a chase sequence with an enemy. Upon completing this sequence, you'll arrive at the end of the hall you fell from, but this entire pitfall can be skipped by stacking beds one on top of another and jumping across the trap, saving about 1.5 minutes. That's only a small part of the dungeon, however, and throughout the rest, there aren't any key items to collect or mini-bosses to fight. All you really need to do is collect the boss key and then complete the proper rooms to advance to the boss. However, the boss door is in the second room of the dungeon. It's just out of reach because you need to raise the water level to get to it, but instead of doing this, players figured out that they can use an echo to get the entire way to the top. And do you have any guesses as to what it is? If you guessed the bed, you're on the right track, as it is used for the initial height gain. And while there were initial strategies that used water blocks to cheese Zelda up to the top, it's actually the Kraltula echo that is the star of this skip. When you spawn a Kraltula, you can interact with it to have it move a set distance where it carries you across any terrain it encounters and even up walls. By using a bed on the first floor of the dungeon, the height boost it gives is just enough for a Kraltula to get you to the second floor. And after grabbing the boss key, another Kraltula is used to ascend to the boss door, skipping about 75% of the dungeon. Aside from these skips, there were a few others, such as skipping the quest that brings you to Blossu by jumping over the trees, but the first any percent runs mostly just went to each of the 8 dungeons and defeated the bosses, for a total time of about 5.5 hours. This is a very long time for a speedrun, and it was off-putting to some players, with one of the early record holders, Smudey, saying that he hopes a major skip was found because a 5.5 hour run isn't something he has time to play consistently. And fortunately for him, later that same day, the first piece of that major skip would be found. But before we get into that, we need to talk about this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, AI, and programming. Habits can be a powerful tool when it comes to learning, and Brilliant only requires a few minutes each day, helping you create a great habit to build real-world knowledge with its lessons, furthering your goals, whether they be professional or personal. Brilliant also makes it easy to learn on the go, as its lessons can be completed while you're on your mobile phone, so if you have a morning commute, you can open the app and dive into a new topic, or freshen up with a practice session in a course you've already started. With Brilliant, you can turn your curiosity into applicable knowledge where you can build and use formulas to solve real problems in business and everyday life. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Abyssoft or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and with that, let's get back to the big discovery in Echoes of Wisdom. Looking at the Discord, InAMuffinCup announced that they had found a way to keep control of Zelda while the map was opened, and the setup was quite straightforward. The first thing you needed to do was get close to a void out, which are trigger volumes that surround the game world to stop you from going off the map or getting to an area you shouldn't have access to yet. Next, you'll need to use an echo to spawn a sign, then target the sign and press A to read it just as you walk into the void out. Before you lose control of Zelda, you'll need to quickly open the echo menu, and if done correctly, you'll spawn back into the world with the echo menu active. If you then open the map, you'll still have control of Zelda, but the game will be in a state where it's both paused and unpaused, and you'll know if it was successful because the mini-map will be visible, which gives you some indication of where you are in the overworld. Once the glitch is active, you can't see what you're doing except by looking at the minimap, but it doesn't affect your ability to play the game, as you can still interact with most objects, geometry retains its collision, and enemies can still damage and kill you. You might think this doesn't sound exciting, but if you've been around the speedrunning scene for other games recently, you'd know that having control of your character when a menu is open can be a huge deal, as the Gen 4 remakes in Pokemon were broken by having menus stored on the screen, allowing players to skip to the end of the game. Players were immediately aware that this glitch could have huge implications for the speedrun, with ProgramFairy discovering that it persisted through death just 2 hours after it was discovered, and InAMuffinCup figured out that by opening the inventory menu while in storage, you can go to a shop and get infinite rupees by selling items and editing the amounts in the storage menu. While this trick was useful, it didn't break the game, as players were looking for a way to skip large amounts of content to bring the length of the run down. And just 4 hours after map storage was discovered, Zelda speedrunner Gymnast86 posted this video. In Echoes of Wisdom, there's a warp mechanic that lets you fast travel to any warp point you've unlocked on the map. All you need to do is open the map, select the waypoint, and confirm the warp. Gymnast was messing around while he had a map storage active and found that if you select a warp point, then bring up another instance of the map, the previous menu will stay active while you select a point with the cursor, and on confirming the warp, you're taken to a completely different location. Within 10 minutes, he tested the glitch further and found out 2 things. The only locations he could warp to were Seaside Village and Suthorn Ruins, and sometimes the wrong warp crashed the game. Players were quick to investigate this in more depth, with July being the first person to get a location other than Seaside or Suthorn Ruins, as they discovered that by selecting Goron City as a warp location, they were taken to Zora Cove. Not long after this, in the early morning hours of September 28th, Smudey discovered that if you warp into the Gerudo Sanctum dungeon, you can defeat the boss and complete the quest, skipping all of the cutscenes and content that lead up to it, which proved that skipping content didn't break the game or softlock you in any way. The starting point for Smudey's warp was inside of the Still World version of Suthorn, and Gymnast added that any wrong warp he tried to do while in the Stilled World sent him to Gerudo Sanctum, so there was something going on that nobody understood, which meant it was time to call in the heavy hitters. A crack team of glitch hunters consisting of Echocolat, July, Vilks, Cloud, Cairo64, and Mr. Cheese, yes, the same Mr. Cheese that was involved with the moon warp in Majora's Mask, all set to the task of figuring out what was going on with the wrong warp. As they began experimenting, they did find a few new warps, but one thing they kept running into was that the pool of wrong warp locations appeared to be relatively small, as no matter where they started the warp from in the overworld, they always ended up at the same 5 locations. Luckily, the game had been data mined, and some of the glitch hunters started looking at the variables involved with wrong warping, and an early theory was that Zelda's position may be the variable that determines where you warp to, as the game could be interpreting her position data as the warp target, so changing it might yield different results. However, this was quickly debunked through testing, with the wrong warp no closer to being understood, but the glitch hunters did make an important discovery. In the game's code, there are 2 arrays, one that stores the location for Still World and Dungeon waypoints, and another that stores Overworld waypoints. When the game needs to warp you normally, it looks up some relevant information, then warps you to the appropriate target in the array. But when it came to wrong warping, the glitch hunters figured out that the game was reading garbage data. This is why so many attempts ended up in the same location no matter what steps players were taking. It was very difficult to get the game to send you somewhere other than these locations due to how it was reading the garbage data. But a trick discovered by Ballistixx was about to change Echoes of Wisdom forever. While digging deeper into the game's code, Mr. Cheese observed 4 different outcomes from a wrong warp using the current method. Either you warp to a level with a valid location, you warp to the first location in memory if the level exists but the location doesn't, you crash if the level and location don't exist, or you don't warp if the garbage data isn't targeting a value in the array. This meant that it was indeed possible to wrong warp to any location in theory. It was just a matter of getting the garbage data to point to the correct index value. But before this could be explored further, Ballistixx posted that they hit a wrong warp location that hadn't been observed yet. It warped them from the overworld into Pharaon Temple, which is the first dungeon, but the interesting thing is that this was the first time this location had been reached, and it was all because of a new step that Ballistixx was using that this new location was suddenly possible. It happens very fast, but during the wrong warp, Ballistixx hovers over a location on the overworld map, then very quickly switches to the still world map as the map fades out to perform the warp, which has the game do something very interesting. Instead of warping to an overworld location, the game takes you to a still world location, and the reason was because with this method, the game wasn't using garbage data, but was taking the value of the location you hovered over in the overworld index and plugging it into the still world index. Under normal conditions, if you use outside of Goron City as your warp location, the game stores that into memory and warps you to it. But since Ballistixx was switching the overworld map with the still world map using map storage, the game thought it should be using the still world array. So it takes the location value for outside Goron City and uses it in the still world array, which puts you into the Southern Ruins. This was incredible because not only did it mean that you could select warp targets outside of the 5 that seemed to be random, but that the warp was no longer using garbage data and you could get a consistent location every time. This opened up the entire game for wrong warping, and Onaku was the first to see what happened if you targeted the overworld location that corresponds to the final dungeon in the still world array. And to everyone's surprise, the warp worked. It seemed like the only thing standing between runners and the end of the game was the final boss. But there was one small problem. In a normal playthrough, you're joined by Link when you enter the final dungeon and progress together to reach the boss. But if you wrong warp into the dungeon, something unfortunate happens. When you enter the room with the double doors, Zelda and Link are supposed to split up, but if you wrong warp into the temple, Link never spawns in this room. This isn't a problem as you can continue as Zelda, but when you get to the room with the switch, things fall apart, as the game soft locks when you press it to open the doors if Link isn't in the room. This was a huge letdown, as speedrunners had just found a way to warp to the end of the game, only for it to have a soft lock. But fortunately, speedrunners are used to games trying to thwart their efforts to break them, and methods of picking the soft lock started being theorized. First, some events in the game's logic were identified that could be the culprits, as completing the requirements to pass these flags may break the soft lock, with Mr. Cheese theorizing that entering the dungeon normally instead of warping into it might satisfy the logic and make the dungeon completable. The problem with this solution, however, is that the dungeon's regular entrance isn't a spot you can wrong warp to, as you need to talk to Link after defeating some enemies to enter it properly. Players then theorized that clipping through the wall with the locked door could be another alternative, but no glitch had been found that achieved a wall clip, so the soft lock remained firmly shut. Things stalled here for about a day as players theorized and tried to find different ways of breaking the soft lock, and out of nowhere, SixPathsPanda uploaded a video that smashed the soft lock to pieces. If you pause the same frame you activate the switch and reload the save, you'll be brought back to the same room, except the doors leading to the next room will both be unlocked. And on proceeding, Link will be in the room with you, breaking the soft lock and letting you proceed to the final boss. This cut hours off the speedrun, with Onaku getting the first record the same day it was discovered with a 1:28. But it could go much lower for 2 reasons. The first is that map storage and the soft lock skip are both precise tricks that can have a high fail rate, so players sometimes reset constantly just to make them work. And the second is that since Zelda doesn't have any powerful echoes or upgrades, Link has to do most of the work in battle. Link's AI doesn't always take the actions that let him deal lots of damage, and sometimes he can do things that are detrimental to the run itself. So runners are at the mercy of what the AI feels like doing in the final fight, which can add a ton of variance. But the next day on October 1st, these problems wouldn't stop Gymnast when he set the first sub-hour time. Using this route, the record dropped to 50 minutes and 42 seconds, which was set set by Onaku, but there was still one problem. Players had to complete a large portion of the early game before they could get to a location where they could set up a void out for map storage. So if something could be found that voided them out earlier, they could save even more time. And do you have any guesses as to how they did this? Of course, they used a bed to reach the void out at the top of the map and set the menu storage up that way, with it dropping another 8 to 10 minutes off the run, and a Tappy having the current record of 36:53. But the story doesn't end here, as players in Japan found a way to use map storage to bring Link to the overworld, which means that even in Zelda's own game, you can still play as Link. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next exciting episode of Abyssoft Z.